What if the suffering you carry on your shoulders, that silent weight no one sees, wasn't sent by God, but by a lie you accepted as truth? What if what you call divine will is actually a biblical distortion that keeps you trapped, guilty, confused, and distant from the true essence of the gospel? This question isn't comfortable, and that's precisely why it needs to be asked now. Because perhaps you're suffering not because of what God said, but because of what someone else said. He said, how many times have you heard phrases like, if it hurts, it's because God is punishing you. If you haven't won yet, it's because you don't have enough faith. If your life isn't prospering, it's because God is putting you in the desert. Words laden with guilt, toxic religiosity, and distorted interpretations of Scripture. These are teachings that masquerade as truth, but generate shame, fear, self-punishment, and isolation. And the worst part, often they are repeated with such conviction that they seem indisputable, but they are distortions. They are misconceptions. They are mistakes which may be killing you from the inside. You are not suffering because God hates you. You are not being crushed because God has abandoned you. You may be suffering because you have been taught to interpret God's love as if it were a court sentence. Perhaps you have been trained to believe that the gospel is a rule factory, not an invitation to redemption. And that is where everything begins to crumble. When we confuse punishment with care, guilt with repentance, fear with faith. When we think that God only loves us when we are clean, perfect, victorious, strong. And when we err, when we fail, when we plead for a sign and heaven seems silent, that is when many believe they are being judged and begin to carry a cross that God never placed on their shoulders. The suffering that stems from lies is more cruel than the suffering that stems from truth. Because truth heals, lies corrode. A religious lie has the power to transform a sincere heart into an exhausted, worn-out heart full of guilt and fear. And this does not come from God. This comes from the misinterpretation of what He actually said. The Bible was never written to imprison. The Scriptures were never an instrument of spiritual humiliation. The gospel was never designed to crush those who are already wounded. But when texts are used out of context, when verses are taken out of their original setting, when divine intention is replaced by human tradition, faith ceases to liberate and begins to wound. And this is where you need to stop and honestly ask yourself, are you suffering because of God? Or because of a false idea about Him? How many times have you felt ashamed for not having enough faith? How many times have you thought that your pain was a consequence of an old mistake that God supposedly hasn't forgiven yet? How many times have you believed that your struggle was a message of divine disapproval, when in reality it might just be part of life and not a spiritual decree? Perhaps this video is the first time someone has told you this so bluntly. Much of their suffering does not come from God, but from the distortions that have been made about Him. And if that's true, then it's time to face what no one has explained to you until now. Stay with me, because the truth we are about to reveal will confront, liberate, and rebuild everything you thought you understood about God, pain, and faith. And when you hear it, you will never be able to go back to your old religion. If something inside you has begun to awaken so far, if this message seems to be poking at deep wounds you've tried to ignore for years, then I need you to take a quick pause before we continue. Because this video isn't just another piece of content to watch and forget. It's a tool for liberation. And if you want to break free from these distortions that have imprisoned you, you need to walk with me to the end. So before we continue, leave your comment below. I want to know if these words make sense, if you've ever experienced this kind of spiritual pain, if you've ever felt guilty about something you were taught as if it were biblical, but that you now realize perhaps never was. The comment isn't just engagement, it's building awareness. It's you saying, I'm waking up, and go ahead and like this video now, because it needs to reach those who are bleeding in silence without understanding why. The platform only delivers this type of content if you interact, and if this message has value to you, then help spread it. If you haven't already signed up, sign up now, because what comes next will delve into all of this with even more clarity, force, and revelation. We're going to dismantle one by one the false ideas that are causing you unnecessary suffering. Take a deep breath. Get ready. Because the next part won't just inform you, it will confront you. And after this, you'll never look at suffering the same way again. The root of the problem has never been God, never the Bible, never the gospel itself. The real poison lies in how many people have interpreted, distorted, and preached these words over time. When interpretation becomes more powerful than the text, when tradition speaks louder than context, when guilt becomes a spiritual tool, a type of faith is born that doesn't heal, it makes you sick. A faith that doesn't liberate, it imprisons. A faith that doesn't illuminate, it manipulates. And perhaps you are suffering today because your experience with God has been filtered through this type of contaminated, toxic, emotionally destructive faith, masked as holiness. Many people have learned to read the Bible as if consulting a judge, expecting sentence, punishment, disapproval, and not as if approaching a father, seeking guidance, comfort, and truth. And when the gospel is transformed into a tribunal, everyone sees themselves as guilty, insufficient, inadequate, condemned. You failed. God is punishing you. You are sick. God is disciplining you. Your life is difficult. God has abandoned you to teach you. How many times have you heard this kind of phrase? How many times have you accepted it as absolute truth, even when something inside you begged you not to believe it? What no one told you is that these doctrines, when misinterpreted, don't generate transformation. They generate fear, and fear doesn't produce faith. Fear produces dependence, blind submission, spiritual paralysis. You think you're serving God, but in reality you're serving the fear of making mistakes. You don't seek holiness out of love. You try to be perfect because you're afraid of being rejected. And this is one of the greatest spiritual distortions of all time. Guilt is used as a belt, shame as a tool of control, fear as doctrine, and the name of God is used as a seal of authority. And so a generation of emotionally broken, spiritually exhausted believers is created, full of doubts, but forbidden to question. Because questioning in this sick logic means rebellion. It means lack of faith. It means being used by the enemy. And then what remains? Silence. The silence of those who suffer but cannot speak. The silence of those who fear disappointing God simply by admitting they are tired. The silence of those who carry the gospel as an emotional prison, not as good news. But let's be honest, who said God wanted this? Where did Christ say that pain would be proof of spirituality? Where did the Bible teach that suffering is automatically punishment? The problem is that texts have been taken out of context, interpreted with fear, imposed with human authority, and transformed into doctrines that hurt more than they save. And when the Bible is used as a weapon, it ceases to heal and begins to slowly kill someone's ability to see God's love. Many are emotionally destroyed because they received the right message from the wrong voice. Sincere people with real faith, but with souls scarred by toxic interpretations such as God only accepts you when you are strong. If you have anxiety, it's because your communion is weak. Those who truly trust don't suffer. Lies. Lies disguised as biblical language. Lies that are sustained by half-truths, and that's why they deceive so well. And when the person realizes they can't meet the impossible standard, they feel spiritually unsuccessful. And then the cycle begins. Guilt, fear, discouragement, withdrawal, and silence. Not because God rejected this person, but because they believe He would reject them. This type of teaching doesn't produce free people. It produces dependent, emotionally controlled people, full of religious traumas, people who are afraid to pray because they think God doesn't want to hear them. People who are afraid to feel sadness because they think it's a sign of disbelief. People who carry extra weight, which was never placed there by God, but by the religion that should have set them free. And that is why we now need to expose these distortions, deconstruct the lies, and reclaim the true nature of the gospel. Because a healthy faith is not born of fear, it is born of truth. A mature faith does not develop under threat, it develops under revelation. A transformative faith does not paralyze, it awakens. God does not want slaves afraid of making mistakes. He wants children capable of growing. And growing hurts, but it doesn't destroy. It corrects, but it doesn't dehumanize. It confronts, but it doesn't condemn. If you're watching this video and something inside you is saying, "That's me," then know that you are not the problem. The problem is what you've been taught as if it were God, but it never was. Faith shouldn't make you feel worse. Faith shouldn't emotionally cripple you, and if that kind of faith has been ruling your life, maybe it's time to lay everything on the table and start over from scratch. And before we move on, I want you to write in the comments if you've ever been hurt by religious interpretations. You can even leave something simple, like, "This opened my eyes," or "Now I understand what no one ever explained to me." This helps other people realize they're not alone in this battle, and helps this video reach those who urgently need to hear this. Breathe. Get ready, because what we're about to reveal will shake internal structures you may not even have known were binding your soul for years. And the next section will address the most common lies and expose them to the light once and for all. This won't be comfortable, but it's necessary, and it doesn't end here. If there is one of the most powerful and destructive lies ever planted in the mind of someone seeking God, it is this: that he is a cosmic dictator, a stern monarch sitting on a cold throne, noting every mistake, ready to punish at the first opportunity, observing humanity not with compassion, but with suspicion, an image of God built on fear, surveillance, control, and constant threat. An image that not only distorts the gospel, but distorts the soul of those who try to follow it. And perhaps you have carried this vision for too long without realizing how much it has poisoned the way you pray, how you believe, how you see yourself. When spirituality is shaped by this toxic idea, everything becomes fear. You pray with fear of praying incorrectly. You read the Bible with fear of misinterpreting it. You live in fear of disappointing a God who seems never satisfied, never kind enough, always distant, always angry, always ready to pass judgment. And this idea is so common that it goes unnoticed, but it infiltrates everything. It transforms the gospel into an emotional prison. And worse, it causes many to turn away from God, thinking they are fleeing a tyrant, when in reality they are fleeing a caricature created by men. This is the divine terror that many have learned to call fear of the Lord. But this has nothing to do with fear. It has everything to do with panic. It has everything to do with a faith based on threat, not transformation. And a faith based on threat doesn't mature anyone. It only keeps people obedient through trauma. This is not the gospel. This is emotional abuse disguised as spirituality. What impresses me is how popularized this image has become, to the point of becoming the norm. How many grew up hearing that God is always watching you, as if he were a spiritual policeman noting infractions? How many heard that God withdraws blessings if you fail in details, as if he governed the universe based on a legal contract and not on a covenant of love? How many were taught that if they don't pray the right way, at the right time, in the right pattern, God simply turns his back on them? This type of theology generates religious neurosis, not spiritual intimacy. And that's why so many people, even within the church, are emotionally tired, exhausted, full of spiritual anxiety. Because they are not serving God, they are trying to escape the wrath of a being that doesn't exist. They are trying to survive a God invented out of human fear. They are trying to earn the love of a God who, according to the Bible, already loved them first, but according to distorted religion, only loves those who have earned it. And this distances you from the truth on deep levels, because how can you trust someone you fear more than you love? How can you surrender yourself to someone you believe could destroy you at any moment? How can you grow spiritually if every misstep is seen as proof that you are worthless? This view of God doesn't make anyone holy. It makes people hide. It makes people lie about themselves to appear spiritual enough. It makes people wear religious masks because deep down they believe that if God saw who they really are, he would surely reject them. And so fear becomes the language of faith. But fear has never been the language of the kingdom of God. Fear is the language of control. It is the language used by those who do not trust in the power of love to transform, and therefore need threats to tame. The true God does not control by force. He draws by love. He does not need to act like a dictator because he is Father. And a loving father does not watch over his children, waiting for them to make a mistake. He remains present, waiting for the moment to restore. But look what false doctrine does. It takes God's justice, which is perfect, and transforms it into tyranny. It takes God's holiness, which is absolute beauty, and transforms it into a reason for despair. It takes reverent fear, which is admiration, and transforms it into psychological terror. And while this happens, people begin to hate themselves inside, thinking they are honoring God. They begin to repress feelings, feign strength, hide weaknesses, because they believe that God only values those who never fall. This is extremely serious. This is devastating. This is contrary to the message of the cross. If God were the dictator that many preach, Christ would never have wept with those who wept. He would never have sat with sinners. He would never have healed those whom religion had rejected. He would never have restored those whom the law wanted to stone. He would never have loved first. He would never have died for people who barely knew who he was. The gospel of terror does not combine with the Jesus of the Gospels. They are incompatible messages. Either God is love or he is a tyrant. There is no middle ground. And now we come to the most painful point. Many people haven't rejected God. They've rejected the distorted image of God they've been taught. People hurt by religion aren't running away from the Creator. They're running away from the monster they created in His name. And maybe you're among them. Maybe you can't pray because you're afraid of not being accepted. Maybe you think your sin makes you worthless. Maybe you've learned to see God as a constant threat. Maybe you live expecting punishment. And if that's the case, then it's time for a radical adjustment. It's not God who needs to change. It's your view of Him. Before we continue, I want to honestly ask you something. Write in the comments now if you've ever been afraid of God instead of loving Him. If you've ever felt that He was just waiting for your downfall. You can comment with a simple phrase like, "I've been afraid of God," or "That's me." These words can be the key to freeing other people who also carry this burden. And yes, this also helps the video reach those who need it. But above all, it helps you acknowledge something that no one has allowed you to admit until now. Breathe. Because what comes next goes even deeper. If this distorted image hurt you, get ready. Because we're going to dismantle the next lies with even more clarity. It's not over yet. So let's get straight to the point. No anesthesia, no makeup, no religious filter that makes everything pretty while people bleed inside. How many times have you heard that what you're going through is God's punishment? How many times have you swallowed that phrase as if it were absolute truth, believing that every tear, Every closed door, every illness, every crisis, every failure was a kind of divine punishment for something you did, or that you don't even know if you did. This mentality is spiritual poison. It's a cruel distortion of faith. It's a theology that imprisons, that suffocates, that causes guilt, that destroys trust in God's love. And the worst part, many people are suffering not because of what they've experienced, but because of what he believes about what he is experiencing. Suffering exists, but it's not always discipline. It's not always correction. It's not always a consequence. Sometimes it's just the broken world acting. Sometimes it's just human wickedness. Sometimes it's just the normal chaos of life. But you know what the problem is? When a person believes that everything bad that happens is their fault, they stop fighting. They accept suffering as destiny. They lose hope. They begin to see God as an executioner, not as a father. And that's how faith stops healing and starts to sicken. I want you to understand this deeply. Listen carefully. Attributing to God things he did not do is a form of emotional blasphemy. It's not just flawed theology. It's an attack on the nature of God. Because when you say, I'm suffering because God wants to punish me, but God didn't want that, you're placing an intention on him that isn't his. And that kills you little by little. It distances you from the presence that should be your comfort. It traps you in a relationship of fear, not love. Let's not confuse consequence with punishment, suffering with discipline, pain with judgment. There are pains that come from our own sowing. There are pains that come from others. There are pains that come from the world's system. But there is a fatal error that many churches, leaders, preachers, and even family members commit. Generalize to transform all suffering into divine judgment, to use the pain of others as a sermon on morality. And thus they produce something terrible: religious guilt, weight on the soul, spiritual pain, people who believe they deserve the pain, people who pray and think they cannot be heard because God is still punishing. People who distance themselves from God because they think he is angry with them. This silent heresy destroys more faith than any atheism. And I know there are people watching now who carry this mark. You grew up hearing that God broke you because you disobeyed, that he took away what you loved most to teach you, that your child's illness is for God to heal you, that if you were faithful, this wouldn't have happened. Ubatun. What if I told you that this discourse was never from God, that this logic is more connected to paganism than to the gospel, that Jesus never looked at someone suffering and said, serves them right, it's punishment from heaven. On the contrary, he healed, comforted, restored. He revealed the Father's heart, and the Father's heart is not a torturer, it is a restorer. But why does this idea of divine punishment spread so much? Because it provides an easy explanation for a difficult world. It's a way to maintain control over people. It's a way to manipulate. It's a way of saying, if you are suffering, it's because you deserve it. It's simpler than having to deal with the complexities of life. But I'll go further. This evil doctrine also serves to hide abuses, to justify failures, to avoid responsibility. It wasn't my mistake, it was God's judgment. It wasn't injustice, it was divine will. And the victim remains silent, and oppression takes on the name of holiness. But there's another side, a deeper side, a side that hurts even more. When you believe your suffering is punishment, you stop asking for help. You think you don't have the right to be comforted, that you can't cry, that you need to hold on to pay your spiritual debt. You become a slave to shame. You live in fear of being happy. You think any good moment will be charged later, as if God were a tax collector of joy. This is emotional torture. This is theological imprisonment. This doesn't come from heaven. Now listen carefully. Pain is not proof of rejection. Suffering is not a sign of abandonment. God's love is not measured by what you lose or gain. Jesus suffered, and he was perfect. Job suffered, and God called him blameless. Paul suffered and wrote about joy, Many afflictions are not proof of guilt. They are gateways to transformation. But if you believe that God is punishing you, you will never see redemption in the midst of it. You will only survive and punish yourself from within. And I know this video is stirring up a lot of things inside you. Maybe it's exposing beliefs you've carried for years. Maybe it's bringing to the surface pains you've spiritualized, when in reality you needed to face them truthfully. If it hurts, it's because it's healing. If it's uncomfortable, it's because we're aligning the lens. This is the moment when you need to decide. Will you continue carrying guilt for something God never demanded? Or will you break with this spiritual lie that has made you suffer for too long? If you've made it this far, I need you to strengthen this reflection. Write a keyword in the comments to signal that you are awakening. God is not my punishment. Repeat this. Declare this. Release this. This comment will serve as a milestone in your spiritual journey and will also help the video reach more people who need this truth. And if you want to go further, comment with another phrase. I want to know the true God, because this search is the turning point. Later on, we'll delve into the deeper aspects of this subject, and you can be sure that what comes next will open your eyes in a way you may never have experienced before. But before we move on, I want to see you active in the comments. I want to see this video resonate, because the truth needs to spread, because faith needs to be healed, because love needs to take the place that fear stole. And the next part will touch on exactly that. We're going to expose the most dangerous lie of modern religiosity. And when you understand this, you'll realize that much of your suffering was never God's will, but a consequence of a distorted view of Him. Get ready, because what comes next is powerful. Just stay with me. So let's dive headfirst into the next wound, a wound covered in theological glitter, but which rots the soul from within. The most seductive heresy of the modern generation, packaged as hope but sold as spiritual blackmail. If you have faith, you will never suffer. Have you heard this before? Have you been pressured by it? Have you ever felt like a spiritual failure because the healing didn't come, the miracle didn't happen, the money didn't appear, the door didn't open, the tragedy wasn't averted, even though you prayed, fasted, believed, cried out, declared, did everything right? This is too profound to ignore. And I need you to pay attention with all your senses now, because this lie has destroyed the faith of millions of people, perhaps even yours, without you realizing it. This kind of triumphalist gospel doesn't want to see you set free. It wants to see you deceived. It promises a life where pain doesn't exist, where everything works out if you simply believe enough. And if it goes wrong, it's your fault. Your faith was small, your prayer was weak, your sin was hidden. And look how the manipulation happens. They promise prosperity, healing, victory, abundance, honor, open doors, but they place the weight of the result on your spiritual performance. They take God's name, mix it with emotional marketing, transform faith into a bargaining chip, and sell conditional hope. This is not the gospel. This is commerce. This is spiritual charlatanism. This is emotional slavery disguised as powerful faith. Because when someone believes in this system, they live in a permanent cycle of guilt. Life goes through phases, but they think everything is spiritual. If the money doesn't come, it's because they didn't recite the right verse. If the illness worsens, it's because they didn't have enough faith. If the marriage falls apart, it's because they left a breach. So, in addition to real pain, comes spiritual pain. In addition to human suffering comes the burden of condemnation. This gospel creates people who don't cry because they consider crying a weakness of faith, people who hide their struggles because they think that witnessing pain is confessing defeat, people who smile at church but bleed at home, people who stop asking for help because they feel guilty for suffering. This is cruel, this is inhumane, this is anti-Christian. And you know what's even more dangerous? This type of doctrine produces a disposable faith. While everything is going well, the believer is blessed, strong, a living testimony. But when tragedy strikes, and it strikes everyone, the person feels betrayed, deceived, emotionally destroyed. And many never return to the faith, not because God has abandoned them, but because they were sold a false image of God, a selfish, utilitarian, bargaining image, a banker God who only blesses those who pay, a CEO God who only keeps those who perform, an idol God who exists only to fulfill requests. This is not the Father revealed by Jesus. This is the golden calf, gospel version. And let's make something very clear here. Faith is not a vaccine against suffering. Faith is the strength to get through it. Faith doesn't eliminate the valley of the shadow of death. Faith accompanies you through it. Faith doesn't prevent furnaces. Faith transforms furnaces into testimonies. Faith doesn't prevent tears. Faith transforms tears into seeds. The Bible doesn't promise the absence of afflictions. It promises divine presence in the midst of them. Jesus never said, "Follow me and you will never suffer again." He said, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world." That is real faith. That is the true gospel. But triumphalism distorts this. It takes biblical language and transforms it into a tool for demanding payment. It infantilizes faith. It makes you believe that God is merely a distributor of blessings and that the main task of your spiritual life is to unlock victory mode. This is shallow. This is dangerous. This is the opposite of spiritual maturity. And the shallower the gospel, the more fragile the soul. That's why so many people give up on God when the worst happens, because they never had true faith. They only had a religious expectation. Now I want to poke at an even more sensitive wound. Many leaders preach this gospel because it produces quick results, because it attracts crowds, because it moves money, because it seduces those who are desperate, because human suffering is fertile ground for miraculous promises. And I'm not talking about genuine faith. I'm talking about the mercenary system that uses faith as propaganda. You need to know how to identify this. Your spirit needs to learn to discern when something comes from heaven and when it comes from spiritual marketing. Perhaps you are currently experiencing an internal conflict. Part of you believes in God, but another part doubts because you don't see results. Maybe you think your faith is failing because you are still suffering. Maybe you believe you are being punished because the doors haven't opened. Maybe you've even thought, "I shouldn't be chosen." But now you understand. The problem was never you. The problem was the lie you believed. The problem was the adulterated version of the gospel you were taught. The problem was thinking that faith was a mathematical formula and not a relationship. And before you think we're nearing the end, let me warn you, we're still going to delve into deeper layers. What comes in the next sections will break down structures that have been placed inside you since childhood. We're going to expose myths. We're going to confront traditions. We're going to liberate those who have been imprisoned by fear, religious control, guilt, and the theology of bargaining. And I want you with me until the very last minute. Because if this content is opening your eyes now, imagine what will happen when we reach the conclusion. But before that, I want you to participate. This video isn't a monologue. It's a collective spiritual battle. So leave a keyword in the comments to mark this moment. Right, faith is not a transaction. And if you want to reinforce this message in spirit, also comment, "I reject the gospel of illusion." Every comment helps this video reach people who have been hurt by their faith. Every comment transforms this content into a mission, and I'm counting on you. Take a deep breath, because this video is about to take off. The next topic will expose the psychological and spiritual roots behind this religious culture of performance. And when you understand this, you'll realize you'll never look at your faith the same way again. Continued immediately in the next segment. Just wait. So take a deep breath, because now the conversation is going to enter the most uncomfortable and, at the same time, most liberating part of this entire spiritual deconstruction, because if there is a silent poison that corrodes the soul of those who believe, it is this one. If you are suffering, it's because you don't pray enough. This phrase has destroyed more people than many sins. This phrase has caused people to have crises with God, with faith, and with themselves. This phrase is a sharp knife coated in spirituality, and it is repeated so naturally in religious circles that over time it ceases to be a phrase and transforms into an inner prison. Have you ever noticed? There's always someone suffering, always someone crying, always someone fighting to survive, and there's always someone saying, "Just pray more." As if prayer were an automatic button that solves everything, as if suffering were mathematical proof of your spiritual failure, as if God were a call center manager who only answers after the 10th call is submitted. And the worst part, often this accusation comes from those who consider themselves spiritual but are completely disconnected from God's heart. These are people who have learned to talk about faith but don't know how to feel compassion. These are people who have learned to use verses as weapons, not as cures. And then, when you suffer, whether from something emotional, financial, familial, spiritual, or physical, instead of finding support, you find judgment. People don't ask, "How can I help you?" and they ask, "Have you really been praying?" As if suffering were an operational error, a technical failure, as if pain were a sign that you didn't seek enough, didn't pay the price, didn't cry out intensely. That's cruel. That's inhumane. That's emotional manipulation disguised as doctrine, and the most perverse aspect of this logic is that it creates an endless cycle of guilt. Because the more a person suffers, the more they feel the need to pray. The more they pray, the more desperate they become because nothing changes, and the more nothing changes, the more spiritually unsuccessful they feel. Prayer ceases to be a relationship and becomes penance. It ceases to be an encounter with God and becomes psychological punishment. Can you feel the weight of that? This is how it is born, the cult of religious guilt, a conditioned spirituality based not on grace, but on performance. A spirituality where the value of your faith is measured by how much you suffer in silence and how much you blame yourself when you don't get results. And that has a name: spiritual slavery. There are people who can't even pray anymore because every time they close their eyes, they feel ashamed. Ashamed because they think they disappointed God. Ashamed because they think they're not good enough. Ashamed because they believe the pain they feel is their own fault. Can you grasp the magnitude of that? But let me tell you something now that perhaps no one has ever said with this clarity. Suffering is not proof of a lack of prayer. Jesus, the Son of God, prayed and suffered. Paul the Apostle prayed and suffered. Job trusted in God and suffered. Suffering is not evidence of a lack of faith. Sometimes it is precisely evidence that you are on the right path, because there is opposition, because there is purpose, because there is something greater happening behind the pain. But the cult of guilt doesn't want you to think about that. It wants to keep you small. It wants to keep you needy for approval. It wants to keep you dependent on the system. Because the more guilty you feel, the more manipulable you become. This discourse, if you are suffering, it's because you don't pray enough, transforms God into a distributor of spiritual privileges. As if he only moved in favor of the most dedicated. As if someone's worth were determined by the amount of time they spend kneeling, and not by the sincerity of their heart. But the God revealed in Scripture is not the God of merit. He is the God of grace. He approaches the broken, not the perfect. He reveals himself to the weary, not to the show-off. He restores the weak, not the performative. He never demanded prayer as currency. He offered prayer as dialogue. But this kind of religiosity twists everything. And when you internalize this logic, you start to believe that every tragedy is your fault. Every struggle is a punishment. Every delay is a warning. And do you know what the side effect of this is? Despair, self-devaluation, the feeling of not being worthy of God. The soul begins to fear praying because it believes that God is disappointed. And this is the pinnacle of distortion, a spirituality that makes you run away from God when it should give you the courage to seek Him. And before we continue, let me ask you something. Observe honestly. How many times have you held back your tears because you thought crying was a lack of faith? How many times have you hidden your pain because you were afraid of religious judgment? How many times have you knelt down, but not as a child, but as a defendant? This is real, this is silent, and it's happening to millions of people around the world. That's why this video exists. That's why this conversation is necessary. Now pay attention, because the next section will dig even deeper. We're going to talk about spirituality performance and what truly happens in the heart of someone who lives trying to prove to God that they are worthy. And when you understand this, you will realize that there is a path to spiritual healing that hasn't been presented to you. And this path begins when you say, I don't need to pray to prove anything. I pray to breathe. But I'll hold on to this reflection because it's the bridge to the next part. Now, if this message is affecting you, and I know it's affecting many people, I want to ask you a favor that is also a prophetic act. Comment below, but comment with a phrase that breaks this spiritual chain. Write something like this: prayer is not punishment, it is encounter. And if you want to go further, comment as well: I want God as a father, not as an executioner. This helps spread the truth to those imprisoned by guilt. And yes, every comment helps this video reach those who need it. You are a part of this. Breathe, because it's not over yet. We're in the midst of the wound, and the healing begins now. So now we arrive at a part that for many people will sound almost like heresy, because it explodes a lie sustained by centuries of religion, distorted traditions, and superficial interpretations of the Bible. Because there is a biblical truth that almost no one teaches, not because it's secret, but because it's uncomfortable. It doesn't empower religious leaders, it doesn't fuel fear, it doesn't sustain systems, it doesn't control people. And this truth is simple, direct and liberating. Suffering is not a sentence, it's a process. And within that process there is purpose, not punishment. But while this isn't understood, millions continue to live as if God were an impatient judge, as if everything were punishment, as if every tear were a receipt of guilt, as if pain were the signature of divine rejection. And this, of course, destroys faith from the inside out, because how can you trust a God you think chose to hurt you? But when you begin to see suffering from a true biblical perspective, the perspective that Scripture reveals and that institutional religion often hides, something inside you finally breathes, because instead of asking, what did I do wrong to experience this, you begin to ask, what is God forming in me through this? And this shift in mindset is so profound that when it happens, the pain continues to hurt, but it stops corresponding to despair. The tear still falls, but it no longer carries despair. It carries awareness. And awareness is the first stage of healing. The entire Bible is full of this truth, but almost no one teaches it this way, because most prefer ready-made doctrines, catchy phrases, and quick answers. It's much easier to blame the victim than to help the wounded person interpret their pain with spiritual maturity. It's much easier to say, you are suffering because you sinned, than to sit beside the person and ask, what is God trying to show you at this stage? But biblical truth leaves no room for simplistic thinking. Job suffered without being guilty. Joseph was betrayed without sinning. David was persecuted while he was being anointed. Jesus was crucified while he was holy. The question is not, why am I suffering? It's, what purpose does this suffering serve? And when that question changes, everything changes. Because if suffering is merely punishment, it serves no purpose other than to crush you. But if suffering is a process, it becomes the ground where God plants transformation. Pain ceases to be an end and becomes a transition, and this radically changes the way you interpret life. It's not about romanticizing suffering. It's not about idolizing pain. It's not about saying that suffering is beautiful. No. Suffering is hard. It's cruel. It's exhausting. But when you understand that it is refinement, not condemnation, you stop feeling rejected by God and begin to see yourself within a movement of spiritual maturity. This changes everything. This changes the soul. This changes the way you pray. Because you stop asking only, God, take me out of this, and start saying, God, reveal to me what this is generating in me. Do you want to know why this is almost never taught? Because a person who understands suffering as a process ceases to be manipulable. They no longer need to be controlled by fear. They don't submit to discourses of guilt. They don't chase after religious leaders as if they were intermediaries. They learn to hear God in pain. And when someone learns to hear God in the midst of chaos, no one can steal that person away. No one can dominate them anymore. No one can imprison them with distorted theologies. Because they understand that God doesn't only speak in miracles, He speaks in silence, He speaks in waiting, He speaks in the desert, He speaks in solitude. He speaks when everything breaks. And few people have enough courage to teach this because it gives freedom. And free people are dangerous to those who profit from fear. But perhaps the question burning in your mind right now is, then why does it hurt so much? If there is a purpose, why doesn't God just take it away? Because purpose isn't formed in haste. Purpose requires maturation, depth, processing. No tree grows in a day, no sword is forged without fire, and no heart becomes solid without enduring what shatters it. Suffering, which is a process, is building something invisible while destroying something visible, and that's why sometimes it seems like God is silent. But He is not indifferent. He is working. He is digging. He is stirring layers you didn't even know existed. And perhaps no one has told you this. There is pain that reveals things that comfort never could. There is pain that prepares you to carry things far greater than your ordinary life could handle. There is pain that opens your spiritual eyes in a way that joy never could. Not because pain itself is good, but because God uses even that which tears you apart to remake you. But this truth needs to be said like this. Without filters, without romanticization, without catchy phrases. Suffering is not a sentence. Suffering is a stage. It is a place of passage, not of permanence. It is a tool, not an identity. This does not negate the pain, but it heals its meaning. And this will connect with what we're going to explore in the next part, because there's an essential detail that almost no one notices. Suffering becomes unbearable when you believe it's the end. But when you discover that it's part of the process, it ceases to be a prison and begins to become a bridge. A bridge between who you were and who you are becoming. And this transition, even though painful, reveals the presence of a God who works in silence. You don't feel it, but He is there. You don't hear it, but He is instructing. You don't understand, but He is defining your future while healing your past. And before we move on to the next part, I want to ask you something that will truly make a difference in the reach of this message. If this passage spoke to you, comment below with one of these phrases. They aren't just comments, they are spiritual declarations, seeds that generate liberation in others who are going through the same process. Comment, suffering is not punishment, it's a process. Or comment, God is shaping me in the midst of pain. Write this down, declare this, make it visible to those who feel condemned and need to see that there is a way out. Breathe. We're going to go even deeper and climb even higher. We're at the point where the lies begin to crumble and the truth begins to rebuild. The next part will reveal what happens when suffering finally finds its purpose, and that's when the desert begins to bloom. So imagine this with me. What if the suffering you've carried since childhood, the nights you cried unheard, the days you felt as if the sky were silent, and the moments you wondered if God still cared, were in fact moments when He was closer than ever? Not as a judge with a gavel in hand, not as a divine inspector noting your failings, but as a father who understands the weight of pain because He Himself carried flesh, blood, tears, and fear. This is the truth that no one wants to teach because it doesn't control people, doesn't generate guilt, doesn't create dependence on institutions. This truth liberates. This truth restores dignity. This truth restores humanity. And here begins the spiritual turning point that institutional religion almost never touches upon. God is not a distant observer who merely watches human drama as one watches a film. He is God incarnate. He is the God who entered history, felt hunger, felt fear, sweated blood, carried anxiety to the point of saying, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow," to the point of death. It is this God, not the God of religious propaganda, that we are talking about here. The God who suffers with you, the God who knows what it is to be betrayed, abandoned, humiliated, the God who was spat upon by those for whom He came, the God who heard the silence of heaven for a few moments, the God who became pain to destroy the pain within. Because let's be honest, if the Christianity you were taught never allowed you to cry before God, never taught you that suffering doesn't distance you from Christ, but brings you closer to Him, then the gospel you were given was an empty shell. And that's not your fault. There's a spiritual industry that profits from fear, guilt, and insecurity. But the real gospel is so scandalous that it seems unacceptable to religious people. God suffers. God gives Himself up. God walks to the cross out of love, not obligation. He doesn't send you through the fire alone. He enters the fire with you. And it is precisely at this point that we discover something almost forbidden. There is a type of wisdom that is not born from comfort, but from scars. And this type of wisdom can only be learned in the valley. It is in the valley that character is molded. It is in the valley that faith ceases to be discourse and becomes breath. Biblical wisdom does not say, "Do not suffer." It says, "Do not suffer alone." Because when Christ becomes a companion in suffering, suffering ceases to be despair and transforms into a path. And on this path, we discover that even God's silence is pedagogical. Even apparent absence is disguised care. This is the truth that frees the captive from guilt, the sick from self-judgment, the mother who thinks God has abandoned her in the hospital, the man who thinks God has forgotten him after so many failed attempts. They have not been forgotten. They are walking with a God who knows the pain from within. God is not demanding explanations. He is holding their soul so that it does not completely crumble. He's not saying, "Hold on because I want to test you." He's saying, "If you crumble, I crumble with you. And if you fall, I fall with you. But I will not leave you on the ground." Yes, this destroys the religious lie that says suffering is a sign of a lack of faith. Because if that were the case, what would we do with the Christ who wept? What would we do with the persecuted prophets? What would we do with the martyrs? What would we do with Paul, who pleaded 3 times to be healed and heard only, "My grace is sufficient for you"? Faith is not immunity. Faith is resistance. Faith is not control. Faith is surrender. Faith is not the end of pain. Faith is discovering meaning within it. And so if you are here now and feel that everything is too heavy, don't think that this distances you from God. Perhaps it's the opposite. Perhaps it's the exact moment when He is teaching you to see what can only be seen in the dark. The wisdom of fire, the grace of the desert, the redemption of pain. And pay attention. Whoever goes through this kind of process doesn't come back the same. Whoever goes through it gains a vision that no one can buy, a faith that no one can take away, and a spiritual authority that cannot be manufactured, only lived. Now, before we continue, pay attention to what I'm about to ask you, because this could transform the reach of this message. If this content is awakening something within you, if it makes sense to you, if it brought clarity, courage, or even that relief you haven't found in a long time, leave a like now, because that helps this video get recommended to other people who are going through the same storm. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next parts, because we're going to delve deeper into this in a way you've never heard in church. And at the end of the video, I want you to comment with a phrase so we can identify who truly stayed until the end. If this word spoke to you, comment, "He went into the fire with me," or just comment, "I'm in the process, but I'm not alone." These phrases seem simple, but they carry truth, faith, and spiritual unity. Now take a deep breath, because it's not over yet. What comes next completely changes how you see purpose, pain, and destiny. And if you understand this, you will never again face God with fear, but with confidence. Let's continue. And now we arrive at the frightening point, the point many avoid, the point that separates those who merely consume content from those who truly transform lives, because it's no use knowing the truth if you continue living as a slave to lies. It's no use hearing about God's character if deep down you still fear the idea of a tyrannical, vengeful, impatient God ready to punish you for the slightest slip. This is the moment of confrontation. Not a confrontation with the devil, not with the world, not with people, but with yourself, with what you've carried in your soul since childhood, with that distorted image of God planted by preachers who often didn't know the God of love, only the God of fear. This is the moment of spiritual deconstruction, not to abandon faith, but to finally live it freely. Because if you continue to believe that God tolerates you and not that He loves you, you will live as a hostage to guilt, a hostage to religious trauma, a hostage to a gospel that never heals because it only weighs down those who are already weak. How many times have you swallowed your pain thinking that questioning was a sin? How many times have you suffered in silence because believers can't doubt? How many times have you felt anger but were trained to hide it even from God as if He didn't know your heart? All of this is spiritual imprisonment, a prison built with manipulated texts, with theology without compassion, with fear disguised as holiness. But now pay attention. There is a truth that destroys these chains. And this truth is shouting to those who have the courage to listen. God does not fear your doubt. God does not reject your anger. God is not offended by your honest questioning. Do you know why? Because true faith is not silent and obedient like a robot. True faith is alive, intense, full of conflict and sincerity. Jesus Himself cried out, "Why have you forsaken me?" That phrase, if uttered today, would be called rebellion by many religious leaders. But it came from the mouth of the Son of God. So understand this. Perhaps it's not God you need to unlearn, it's the system you were taught about Him. And that's liberating, but also frightening, because it requires courage. It's easier to keep repeating ready-made phrases. It's easier to keep believing in, if you do everything right, God blesses you. If you do wrong, God destroys you. It's easier to live in fear than in freedom. Freedom hurts. Freedom demands awareness. Freedom demands spiritual responsibility. But it is only in that freedom that faith becomes true. And this is where the final confrontation takes place. The decisive point. The watershed moment. Will you remain captive to lies, living as an emotional, spiritual, and psychological slave? Or will you seek the truth, even if it forces you to shatter idols, deconstruct beliefs, challenge traditions, and even frustrate people who expected you to remain blind? Because there is something worse than being far from the truth. It is being close to it, but choosing to ignore it. That is true spiritual danger. That is true soul extinguishing. And understand this, Truth is not just correct doctrine. Truth is revelation that transforms. Truth is an encounter with real love. Truth is realizing that God doesn't demand that you deserve something. He wants you to allow yourself to experience something. But those trapped in the prison of religious fear cannot receive love. They can only obey while trying to avoid punishment. That is not faith. That is spiritual servitude. And this imprisonment is destroying thousands of people who attend churches but have never known Christ. Perhaps you were taught to fear hell, but never learned to trust in love. Perhaps you were taught to repeat verses, but never learned to cry before God without guilt. Perhaps you think you are sinning because you no longer feel anything when you pray, but the truth is that you are emotionally exhausted, because living out of obligation kills the spirit. God doesn't want spiritual zombies. He wants free children, conscious children, children capable of thinking and feeling. And He wants that now, not later, now. So I tell you with all clarity, the greatest miracle that can happen in your life is not a physical cure. It's not a job opportunity. It's not unexpected money. It's the reconstruction of your spiritual mind. It's breaking free from lies and restoring your identity. It's looking to God without fear and saying, "If you are truly love, then teach me to unlearn what has imprisoned me." This requires courage. This requires inner confrontation. This requires maturity of faith. And that's why I'm going to challenge you directly now. If this video is shaking you up, if these words are poking at wounds you've never dared to touch, then you're in exactly the right place. But before we continue, I need you to take a stand. This content has a mission to free people from religious imprisonment, but the algorithm only delivers this if you raise the flag. So now, without further ado, leave a like, because that proves that this type of content needs to be spread. Subscribe, because there are more parts and you can't be left out of the sequence. And at the end, I want you to comment with a code word, so we know who is firmly committed to the search for truth. Comment, "I choose the truth." Or if you want something more intense, comment, "I no longer belong to lies." Write this as a spiritual declaration. This changes the atmosphere. Now breathe, because what comes next will shake things up even more. We're about to enter the part where the old religious system can no longer hide its downfall. And this is where the real transformation begins. Let's continue. So now, in the silence, after everything that has been revealed, when the weight of these truths still echoes in your chest and you feel something inside you stirring, comes the question that no one wants to face, but that needs to be asked. A question so simple, yet so devastating, that has the power to dismantle years of beliefs, rituals, and fears. A question not meant to condemn you, but to awaken you. A question that transforms into a spiritual mirror. Is your pain truly yours? Or is it the result of a lie you were taught about God? Because if it's yours, if it's part of the process, if it's forging, if it's growth, then it has meaning. But if it's merely the result of manipulation, fear, religious oppression, distorted interpretation, then you are suffering for something God never asked you to carry. And that is tragic. That is inhumane. That is the kind of pain that paralyzes faith, that creates traumatized Christians, that generates people who love the Bible but fear the God of the Bible because they have never truly known Him. They have only heard the discourse about Him. This is where the video ends. But your journey cannot end here. You need to continue this conversation outside the video, within yourself, because now that the question has been asked, now that the light has come in, you cannot return to the comfortable darkness. You cannot continue accepting a gospel that only works when you are afraid. You cannot continue worshipping a God who seems more like an executioner than a father. You cannot continue carrying guilt that is not yours, nor beliefs that make you sick. This is the time to decide, Either you close this tab and return to the old spiritual prison, or you dive deep into this transformation. And I'm telling you, if you've watched this far, if you've stayed, if something burned inside you, it wasn't by chance. This is a calling. This is awakening. This is liberation beginning. Because the gospel wasn't made to enslave minds, it was made to liberate hearts. And if your faith is making you sick, then it is not the gospel of Christ. It's a distortion of it. Have you ever noticed that some people talk about God for years and still live tormented? Have you noticed that some people never miss a church service but don't feel peace? Have you noticed that some Christians know everything about sin but nothing about emotional healing, love, or rest? What's missing isn't doctrine, it's revelation. Revelation of who God truly is. Revelation of the love that judges, yes, but to restore. Revelation of the God who corrects, yes, but without destroying. Revelation of the Christ who doesn't sit on a throne to punish, but to carry what you can't carry alone. And this revelation is unfolding before you now. But it demands a response, it demands a stance. There is no transformation without a decision. And this is the moment. So before you leave this video, I need you to do something that seems simple, but carries enormous spiritual weight. Declare that you no longer want to live based on lies. Publicly declare that you choose to walk towards the truth. Do you know how you do that? Starting here in the comments. Comment, I reject lies. I choose the truth. Write that down. It's not about algorithms. It's not just engagement. It's about taking a stand. It's about spiritual action. It's about breaking a cycle. And now, yes, if this video opened your eyes, stirred your emotions, tied your mind in knots and ignited your soul, then you need to leave a like now. It's not vanity. It's a mission. Each like helps this content break through the algorithm's barrier and reach someone who is suffering today because of a spiritual lie. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Because what comes next will be even more profound. We will deconstruct more myths, heal wounds, reclaim the true image of God, and you can't continue walking alone. So subscribe and activate the bell, because the next part of this journey will expose secrets that have long been hidden behind the pulpit. Now take a deep breath, because even after the video ends, the question won't go away. It will stay with you. It will haunt you. It will burn within you until there is an answer. And perhaps this is the first time in a long time that the Holy Spirit isn't condemning you. It's inviting you. The decision is in your hands. Is your pain truly your own, or is it the result of a lie about God? Comment, decide, and return, because the search for truth is only just beginning.